Welcome to everyone. My name is Jill, and I'm a librarian at the Watertown Free Public Library. We're so excited that you've all joined us this evening for this collaboration between the library, the new Repertory Theatre, and the Pigsgusset Initiative. Pardon me. In May, new Repertory Theatre will premiere their second moving play, centering on local Indigenous history. Tonight's event affords a unique opportunity to hear from and ask questions of the Moving Play Playwright, Mwalim Morgan J. Mashpee Wampanoag, and the director, Jaime Carrillo, Aymara. They will be led in conversation by Mishy Lesser, a 19-year resident of Watertown, who is learning director for the Upstander Project, Dawnland, and education fellow at Dodd Human Rights Impact at the University of Connecticut. Mishy co-founded Pigsgusset Initiative to increase communication and promote collaboration among Watertown residents to undo the erasure of Indigenous peoples and to promote inclusive narratives. Please remember, as we proceed, submit any questions you have in the chat box, and please enjoy our conversation this evening. Mishy?
Thank you, Jill, and thank you all for joining us this evening. I want to start by wishing you all good health, whether you are near or far. As Jill said, my name is Mishy Lesser. I use she, her pronouns. I have shoulder length, curly brown, and increasingly silver hair, pale skin, and I am wearing a green vest. I am in my home office with an Emmy Award behind me, and I am so pleased to share this online space with you and with playwright Mwalim Morgan J and director Jaime Carrillo, whom I will introduce in a moment. Like many of you, I am a settler, an uninvited guest on native land. Those of us who live in Watertown are on the land of the Pigsgusset Band of the Massachusetts people and their neighbors in Wampanoag and Nipmuc nations. The Pigsgusset people referred to this place as something that to the English sounded like Pigsgusset, although our Wabanaki and Wampanoag linguist colleagues and friends have assured us that Pigsgusset is the corrupted spelling of a Pigsgusset word, which the English were unable to pronounce. Pigsgusset means the meadows at the widening of the river. And as Jill said, I am part of a local group called Pigsgusset Initiative. Here in Watertown, we are never far from the river, known to its original inhabitants as Quinobequeen, or the Winding River. For thousands of years, the rivers of this region were the highways people used to travel and trade and visit with one another, in some cases across vast distances. On this land, people have lived and loved and hunted and fished and grown crops. Babies have been born and children have played and elders have been buried for thousands of years. I recognize the repeated violations of sovereignty, territory, and water perpetrated by settlers like me that have impacted the original inhabitants of this place for 400 years. As I extend my respect to citizens of the Indigenous nations whose lands we occupy and to their ancestors, I also affirm that this acknowledgement is woefully insufficient. It does not undo the harm that has been done and continues to be perpetrated now against the Indigenous peoples, their land, water, air, and their children. English colonizers who made contact with the original inhabitants of this region at the end of the 16th century and onward brought with them leptospirosis and other diseases, which decimated coastal populations by up to 90% within several years. In their zeal for renaming, the English called this place Saltonstall Plantation and then Watertown, after they migrated here in 1630 and began to dispossess the original peoples of the land. As scholar Christine DeLuca writes in her book, Memory Lands, quote, when Watertown colonists waded into the Charles River in springtime 1631, constructed a weir, and took great store of shad, it is debatable whether they consulted with the series of communities up and downstream who depended on reliable fish runs for their sustenance, close quote. Many of the settlers were stock breeders who needed vast amounts of land for cattle, horses, and sheep. Those animals were destructive of the crops planted by the original peoples of this place. On October 30th, 1675, between 500 and 1,100 Nipmuc people, who the colonial settlers referred to as praying Indians, were taken from their homes in the praying town of Natick, shackled, loaded into horse-drawn carts, and transported to Watertown, where they were placed in canoes that took them downriver to 3 ships that forcibly removed them to the Boston Harbor Islands, where they were abandoned without food, shelter, or adequate clothing for the coming winter. According to the National Park Service, quote, historical records indicate that as many as 1/2 died of starvation, exposure, and lack of appropriate medicines in what has been called a concentration camp, close quote. Those atrocities happened during what is commonly referred to as King Philip's War, which I prefer to call Po-Metacomet's resistance. That is just a small taste of the often overlooked Indigenous history of the place many of us call home. And now let us dig into our conversation about the vital role of Indigenous culture keepers and knowledge holders with our esteemed guests, whom it is my honor to introduce. I will pose a few questions to get the conversation rolling, and then invite you to add your comments and questions in the chat. I am going to assume you have read Mwalim and Jaime's impressive biographies, so I will highlight just a few of their many achievements. Jaime Carrillo is the director of New Rep's Indigenous Moving Play. In New York, Jaime directed 365 days plays at the Public Theater on behalf of the Classical Theater of Harlem, where he was a company member for 6 years. His direction of Lynch Play, an examination of slavery and racism in the US, recreated segregated seating for audiences and received an Audelco Award nomination. Jaime is a Lucille Lortel Award-winning producer. Mwalim Morgan James Peters is the playwright of New Rep's Indigenous Moving Play. A multi-award-winning storyteller, spoken word artist, playwright, oral historian, singer, songwriter, filmmaker, and educator. His stages include theaters, schools, street corners, libraries, galleries, museums, festivals, powwows, jails, nightclubs, temples, community centers, and colleges. He is Associate Professor of English and Communications and Black Studies at UMass Dartmouth. Welcome to our guests. And now to my questions. Mwalim, if you'd like to turn back your video on, thank you so much. I'd like to start with you. What can you tell us about the play and the inspiration that accompanied you as you wrote it? What are you hoping the people of this town and those who visit us will think about differently after experiencing the play?
Okay, well, I guess in terms of the play, it seemed like an interesting sort of project to tackle. Very much like my collaborator, Jaime. I was part of the New York theater and did a lot of environmental theater while I was in the city, in the Bronx and in Manhattan. And so the opportunity to do that type of thing in Massachusetts and around part of my heritage, I thought was an absolute, was a wonderful opportunity. And one of the things I've often tried to explore in terms of my writings, particularly about Wampanoag, Northeastern Woodland Native people, is, and even in terms of writing about people of the African diaspora, is trying to remove the monolith that basically a white supremacist society sort of turns everybody who's not of Europe into when reviewing history. And you even look at, when I'm reviewing the references that I researched in writing this piece, it's the fact that you can easily find the names Roger Clapp in everything. But you don't find, but who were the native people? Who were the Pigsgusset people who came and visited the first time and came and visited the second time with the fish? And were they men? Were they women? These are things that are not talked about or explored or discussed. What is important or what's documented is the particular history of the English, or from the English point of view. And it's trying to remove this monolith. And what I really tried to do, especially before even starting to write, was I went to Watertown and went to Squidnocket Park and just spent some time there. And there's a wonderful tree right in the middle, and realized, yeah, this is the place for it, because it's what we call a story tree. It's very much like the oak tree that the Reverend Joseph Amos of the Mashpee Wampanoag gathered the Mashpee Wampanoag under to preach to on Sunday morning, because we were barred from our own meeting house by Reverend Phineas Fish. And looking at this tree, it reminded me of that memory and the entire tie together of the experience of being colonized as Indigenous people, and wanting to sort of explore that experience, and also, like I said, remove the monolith. And started thinking about more in terms of the modern context, because the other thing that I also try to explore in my writing, we look at, or I should say, we are looked at as Native people, as people who are supposed to live the way that our ancestors did 500 years ago. Now, I don't see any Europeans going home and thatching their roofs, but for some reason, if our style of dress changes, if we have acculturated that which has been imposed upon us, somehow we're no longer who we were. And some of it is also the issue of the fantasy that goes along with the, if you will, I guess you could say, the exoticism of Native people. Because here too, what we find is that sometimes the fascination with Native people is this sort of, if you will, cultural addiction folks have to the exotic. And so now Native people become the exotic. And so these were, I should say, the elements that sort of dictated the writing. Somewhere in there, I think I answered your question. Somewhere in there.
Thank you so much, Mwalim. I so appreciate you lifting up the importance of breaking the monolith, which is part of the stereotype of erasure that we're going to get into in a little bit. So Jaime, I'd like to turn to you and, building off of that, what can you share with us about your vision for directing the actors who will perform in this outdoors moving play? How do you imagine the play interacting with the river and the surroundings, the tree, what Mwalim just described? And perhaps what reflections and feelings might you be wanting to prompt in the audience that comes to experience the play?
Thank you, Mishy. It's a great question. And first, I just want to say thank you to Jill, to you, and to NURAP, the conveners, for this incredible opportunity. I've had the pleasure of engaging with NURAP Theater since I was an undergraduate at Brandeis in nearby Waltham. And so to be able to come back in a way is full circle, especially when we're able to tap into something so personal. Yeah, I think your question is right on the money in terms of how do we connect with the environment and how do we deliver that to the audience experience. And we had a walkthrough, Mwalim, me, Sarah, and Hannah, the production manager, trying to find the right ambiance, for lack of a better word, that takes care of logistical needs, like enough light, like are we going to be away from the wooded area that's going to block the natural sunlight coming in, to how do we get the best view of the water? Because in my heart of hearts, I believe the river is the hero of the story, or the heroine of the story. And so we need, in my opinion, the river to be a backdrop, immediately accessible, but accessible in another way, which is in this theater format. So one example of that, as we were looking, is in the middle of our conversation, we had about 8 geese just come down behind us, land on the water, creating this beautiful sound with their feet and their wings as they touched down. And I pointed, and I talked to the group right away. I said, that is what we hope happens during the play. And if it should happen, we will tell our storytellers, our actors, to embrace that moment, not pretend, oh, that didn't happen, I'm going to pretend that didn't happen. No, it happened. The audience witnessed it. We all experienced it. And guess what? That wouldn't have happened in a traditional theater space, but it's happening in our theater space, and it's immediately part of our scenic experience. So it's being open-minded to what the beautiful park in its natural form already lends us, and then embracing it fully, not seeing it as drawbacks, but seeing it as opportunities and as choices, and so that is initially what we were beginning to tap into during our walkthrough.
Jaime, thank you so much. I feel like you brought us to the river. Both of you did. You brought us to the tree and the park and the geese and the river. So let's shift our conversation just a little bit toward larger issues. And Jaime, you're freezing up on us a little bit, so I don't know if there's anything you can do on your end, because we don't want to miss a word of what you're sharing.
Okay.
Thank you. So this is a question for both of you, and it's a big one. How do you see the role of Indigenous culture keepers and knowledge holders at this moment of US social history, when some people want to reckon with the past while others continue to deny that past, including that genocide happened and continues to happen against Indigenous peoples in the United States. Mwalim, would you like to start on that? Or would you prefer Jaime?
Jamie, you want to tackle that first, bro?
Wow. I mean, so many things are running in through my mind and even through my heart as I hear that. I mean, for one, my first impulse is that there needs to be a catch up regarding our stories. We are so underrepresented, not only in mainstream media, but even in local theater scenes, local art scenes. And there are some areas where our stories are burgeoning, and that's wonderful. But our voice needs to be heard too. And we need to keep adding to that. And so my particular approach for inviting designers and inviting actors and storytellers into this is to reduce barriers and increase access to this theater opportunity. Normally, some folks don't have access to a wonderful established theater like the New Rep, right? You think, oh, it's a different league. I'm not ready yet. I don't have an amazing headshot from Los Angeles. I haven't taken the right classes with the right acting teachers. All of these things go into your mind. And a lot of that is explained by a lack of access and a lack of opportunity and pipeline issues. So one of the important tenets of the approach of this project was to increase the way of access. So we did not do things in the traditional way. You know, we wanted to get to know people where they were at in their development and make that as welcoming as possible, especially since we needed to work in a COVID world over Zoom. So working traditionally wasn't going to work out anyway. So then we might as well blaze a trail that increases access, reduces barriers, and starts to coalesce our voices.
Beautiful, thank you.
I would say it's an interesting situation because when you think as culture keepers and particularly storytellers, and also we look at our social conditions, our situation, and even history, it's sort of a close the door, they're coming in the windows. As culture keepers, our first responsibility, as I see it, is to pass on our information to the next generation, to the next 7 generations. That's our first, and the next 7 generations of our communities, of our lines, of our cultures. That's our first priority. And in looking at the situation in terms of reckoning, what we have to be very honest about is that if we look back in history, we had periods of reckoning, quote unquote, before. This is going to be my 53rd year around the sun, and the year I was born about 2 months, 2 days after the assassination of Martin Luther King. And America had a point of reckoning, even down to where we had the Kerner report that came out, the middle of the road bipartisan report that said the biggest problem in America right now is racism and white supremacy. This is an actual federal report published in 1968. So we had reckoning, and then it sort of got carved down, and most of the reckoning was based around weakening the resources of Black and brown people, of creating dependencies, if you will, even down to funding. The Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, all came into this point of reckoning, and then suddenly, wham! It was pulled away, and now the resources were pulled away with it too. And of course, like, for example, if you look at New York City, the sudden yanking away of resources is how we got hip hop. And, and this speaks also to what Jaime was saying in terms of unusual circumstances. Street culture, street theater, street poetry, these are all things that are part and parcel of our culture. It goes back to storytelling in the marketplace. It goes down to street performing, and like I said, street theater. What we're essentially doing with this play is street theater. There is the improvisational aspect. And my background in the arts is primarily or initially as a jazz musician. So the not concept of take the melody and then improvise for the next half hour before you reintroduce the original melody is part of what I see as art. And as James was just speaking about with the geese and the ducks as they were landing in the river, that would become part of the theater. Yeah, that's part of the improvisation. That's part of the magic of the moment. That's part of the art, if you will. That's part of the experience, and it's the native aesthetic. Even if you think about it, when you consider that our music, the flute, for example, is a depiction of nature, the bird songs. You think of our dances, the crow hop, our observations of nature are part of our art and are part of our aesthetic. That's part of our heritage and tradition. So it's this, what you're experiencing is Indigenous theater, or I should say a contemporary interpretation of Indigenous theater, because the improvisation is part of the storytelling. The interruption is part of the performance. The spontaneity is part of the magic. And that's what we're collaborating to recreate here, is really that experience. And in a very Miles Davis kind of way, where the actors want to hear the music too. So there is no fourth wall. There, you as an audience member, you've actually passed the audition, and now you're part of the show. We're going to enjoy it, and this is part of the tradition. This is part of the tradition, and it's part of the cross-cultural tradition. Because when you think about it, for example, you look at a play like Jean Genet's The Blacks, which is basically total deconstructionist theater. In a manner of speaking, what he's actually doing, very much the way Brecht did, is reintroducing Indigenous theater, is reintroducing the root of pageant. That's what we're really trying to explore with this.
Beautiful, so powerful. I think you're getting us all more excited. We want the play to open soon. So we can...
It kind of did already. They're just coming to see the rest of it.
True that.
The show started now. Actually, no, it actually started when all of us showed up to the park. That's when the play started.
Mm-hmm.
When we showed up to look at the space. And what I have to say is what I enjoyed was our conversations about the different spaces, and the fact that, wow, both of them are great. What do we do? Both of them are fantastic for different reasons. But both sections of the river that we looked at. And I'm almost down for one day let's try it here, and one day let's try it. But it's all the river, and it's all the experience, and it's all the metaphor, and it's it's looking at history, and it's looking at history through present day eyes.
Mm-hmm. So to that looking at history, some of us here are really, we talk about the importance of unlearning the false narrative about local history that predominates both in schools and out of schools. And we think it's really important to learn a more inclusive telling of the history of this region and more broadly this country. And so I wonder if you can talk about the role of theater in truth telling and in helping audiences, especially non-Native audiences, feel uncomfortable as part of our process of unlearning and growth that we need to go through. Do you want to continue on, Mwalim, and then Jaime can grab it?
Okay. One meaning of the word entertain is to consider. Not necessarily to enjoy or to make fun, but to consider. If you were being entertained, if you were entertaining an idea, you are considering, or you are being considered. That's what the word actually means. So if we're providing entertainment, what we're providing is a point of consideration. That's the first thing to consider. When we look at theater, and we look at theater history correctly, and consider that the Greek concept of theater actually came from the temples of Memphis and Kemet, otherwise known as Egypt, and that was a transformation ritual for and the audience were actually, if you will, being treated by a transformation ritual being performed by the priests and priestesses of the temple. And you look at that's what theater truly is. Even if you look at Aristotle's Poetics, when it then ends up in the hands of the Greeks. When you look at Aristotle's Poetics, it's even when he talks about the catharsis. The catharsis is not always pleasant, but it's a realization. It's the emptying, if you will. It's the beginning. It's the commencement, I guess you could say. So in terms of theater, theater tells truths. In fact, all fiction oftentimes tells more truths than fact, because fiction and plays and theater require us to explore human dynamics that sometimes go deeper than a single experience. Sometimes we can tell multiple truths with a single story. So the story itself isn't true, but the elements of the story and the human experience and the nature and the thoughts and the concepts that you're undertaking, that is that's pretty much what we're trying to bring forward, or that pretty much is, I should say, the job of theater. We have to remember that we're a temple, and that when you come into that park, you're entering a sacred space. You're entering the land of the Pigsgusset people. That is a sacred space. You are standing on the bank of Quibnama, the meandering river. That is a sacred space. That is where Bass and Alewife fed many people. That is where, when the springtime would come, our ancestors would bring our canoes up from the bottom of the river where we stored them. And we could go out and we could fish and we could travel and we could race each other. And these were the activities that we did more so for the pleasure of the creator. Our concept of competition was to please the creator. It wasn't about competing with each other. That's a European concept. And our concept of God is not removed from us. We have a great spirit, and the great spirit connects us all when we stand in the circle. So this is the thing to understand about theater. When you enter a theater, even though government separated it, when you're entering theater, you're entering a temple. And you're participating in a healing ritual, whatever the theater is. And understand, especially, that's at the root of what we're doing with this.
Thank you so much. Jaime, do you want to speak to that, or do you want me to go on to the next question?
I'll speak a little bit to it, although I don't envy following those powerful and moving words that Mwalim just shared with us. But I would say that I feel that theater is the ideal forum and experience for people of different walks of life, different philosophies, different opinions to come together for a shared experience and have an exchange. Even if it's sitting in silence or sharing moments or at a talk back afterwards or even at a surround event much like this. Theater creates a safe environment for unlearning, for difficult questions, and for unpacking historical truths, things that did happen. So, for example, you mentioned the play that I did in New York, Lynch play. We did have segregated seating. We recreated segregated seating for the audience. We had a people of color section in the back, and we had a white section up front. And we wanted to put that in all of the disclaimers and all of the postcards and posters and announcements, because we wanted to recreate what really existed here, right? That really existed. We're not inventing that. We're not fantasizing something that, out of thin air. It really existed. And we wanted to recreate that experience so that people can get into a mindset of unpacking narratives and old truths. And I had different reactions to that. I had people say, "I just want you to know, I fully disagree with this, but I'm here to see the play," and they would walk in. And then I had people say, "Oh man, are you out of the seats in the back? Because I came here to experience that, so I'll come back on a different night so that I can be in that seating section." So that leads to my point, which is theater is the one place where phoniness doesn't work. It just doesn't work. It doesn't work for the playwright's perspective. It doesn't work from the director's input, nor from the actors, the storytellers, nor from the audience. Everyone can sniff out a moment that's phony and rings hollow, right? So in that vein, we can have some meaningful dialogue as we look to form a more relevant truth.
So, Jaime, everybody's going to think that this next question was set up to follow what you what you just said, because it's the perfect segue. And this is the last question I'm going to pose to you and Mwalim, and then we're going to open up to see if there are any other questions in the chat. This question asks us to widen our gaze far from the river and the tree and the geese, and then bring it back home. The people of Colombia are undergoing a historic and complex and controversial process of truth-telling and reckoning with the pain of their past. Civil war has gone on for many, many decades there. And they've created a post-Civil War court whose goal, among other things, is to generate a common narrative for the people of Colombia. Do you think it's possible to develop a common narrative about the history of the place now called United States? And if so, what is the role of theater in this process? And if not, what is the role of theater in that process? Jaime, would you like to continue with that and then toss it to Mwalim?
Well, wow. I'm experiencing a number of feelings here, a range of feelings. So first off, I'll agree with you. We did not set that up. My answer was not in setup to your upcoming question. I'm reacting initially like what you pose is incredible food for thought, not just for our brains, but for our souls. I think any such attempt would provoke in all of us some soul searching, because we all are in different places. I commend the efforts of trying to end old arguments, dispel old paradigms. I think that is important because, to be honest, the next generations are already there. In a way, they're demanding it, and their threshold for old stereotypes is gone, if not waning, pretty quickly. I'd love to hear what Mwalim's initial impressions are, and possibly add to that. I do think theater is an essential tool in that, because it can help provide a balanced evaluation of some really strong feelings. And then you can create feedback, you can create surround events to help heal, to help a community process together. Every community is going to be in a different place. So what you bring up to me sounds like a long process that each community would have to take on in their own time. But those are some of my initial reactions.
Thank you, Jaime. Mwalim?
It's funny because it makes me think back to the monolith. And what that becomes is just another way to package the monolith. In some ways, it reminds me of what I guess ends up being or I guess I should say it is well-intentioned, or it might not be. But when I look at certain community boards and community groups, for example, and they have now this focus on diversity and inclusion, unfortunately, it ends up always translating to tokenism. We need a African American, we need a Native American, we need a Latina, we need a, and what ends up happening is they find the one, the one, the one, and the one. So now what you have is a 12-member board that now has 4 people of color. And that now becomes what is considered diversity. And it's the same kind of thing where it's like, you can't have a general story. Like, for example, let's not even look at the Western Hemisphere. Let's just look at the North American continent, the United States and Canada. 500 plus nations. Prior to colonization, prior to contact, prior to the doctrine of discovery, 500 plus nations. Some were already here before ice ages. Some, yes, traveled from Siberia, but not everybody. When they tell us the Bering Strait story in the narrative, that's, so everybody can say, oh, we're all immigrants. Well, yeah, there were some people who crossed the Bering Strait. And guess what? They encountered folks who were already here and cultures that were already here. 500 plus people. That's at least, I would say, 300 different languages. Because some of us did speak variations on each other's language, but yet and still, that many different languages, that many different cultures, that many different cultural mixes. Consider how many of us were here on this side of the Mississippi River, this side of the Connecticut River, this part of this little piece of Turtle Island. How do we all tell one story? There are certain groupings. Yes, you'll say European, but guess what? You're still of the UK, and break it down even further, you're still of England, Scotland, or Ireland. You're still of Germany. And it's acknowledged that you're different people with different cultures, even though, let's face it, the Germans are the royal family of Britain. But still, they're considered different people. Queen Sophia, who is Queen Elizabeth's great-grandmother, whose parentage was Portuguese and West African, was actually in Germany because she had married into German royalty. But they're all considered different people. But for some reason, when it comes down to us, we have to tell one story. And somehow it's believed that we all have the same story to tell. Example, I'm a Wampanoag, I'm a Mashpee Wampanoag, writing a story about the Pigsgusset. Technically, they're a different nation. We spoke a similar language. We had similar experiences. We had a similar culture. But I'm respectfully telling the story of another people who are in unison with my nation, the Massachusetts, the Wampanoag. I hope I answered the story. I hope I answered the question somewhere in there.
I mean, in some ways, it's a question that doesn't have an answer, but it's important for us to wrap our minds and our hearts, as Jaime said, around it. And you know, a relative of yours, Mwalim, whose name is Gisa Tanamuk, who's a friend and colleague of mine, one of the things he's taught me and I've sort of brought into my work as an educator is about the view from the shore and the view from the boat. And of course, those of us who were non-native were brought up thinking that the view from the boat of the colonial settlers was the only view, and that there was no such thing as a view from the shore. And, you know, I guess perhaps the people in Colombia are trying to figure out, is there a way that their different truths, whether, you know, it's the truths of the people in rural communities that were victimized from different, you know, from different forces, whether these different narratives can cohabitate in a space where someone who was a guerrillero could recognize that there's a different truth than their own, and someone who was in the militia could recognize that there was a different truth of a guerrillero. And to bring that to us, without attempting to homogenize and thereby destroy and assimilate, which is what the dominant culture in this country tries to do, is it possible that non-native people could come to a place of acknowledging the history that most of us did not grow up knowing, and that, in other words, is there space for that coexistence? And there's a question that Eric put in the chat where he says, you know, there were English settlers, but long before there were also Africans who were brought here against their will. You know, what is their place in the story you envision?
Most definitely part of the narrative. In fact, there is a very interesting exhibit that took place at one point called Eating Out of the Same Pot that talked about that experience. And some of the experiences that I've been researching in my own community is the fact that the Wampanoag and the Nipmuc gave asylum to fugitives. Not fugitives, I'm sorry, refugees. Allow me, my deep apologies for using the colonizer term. They were not fugitives. We gave sanctuary. That is part of the discussion. Part of the discussion is when we acknowledge that Crispus Attucks, whose last name means deer in our language, was Wampanoag until his narrative served the purpose of the abolitionists. These are some of the narratives, local narratives that need to be explored and brought to light. And in terms of looking from both sides and looking at looking from the shore and looking from the boat, what people don't realize is that the Norse visited this continent many times and knew when to leave. So seeing a boat from the shore was not unusual for us. And seeing a boat full of white faces with blue eyes was not unusual to us. We also need to acknowledge that the Africans who first came, as evidence suggests, did not come in shackles, but came in their own boats. You know, that is part of the history that needs to be acknowledged as well. So, that, when we talk about people landing, we had people who landed. We had white people who came here before. We had Africans who came here before, which is why our guard was down. We see a boat full of people, nothing new. They need food, fine, feed them. That's what we do. That's the story of Watertown, the fish and the biscuit. You see some strangers. Oh, it's morning time. They're probably going to want breakfast. Here, let me hook them up. That's what we do. And it never had, it never had repercussions like that before. That's part of the story that needs to be told.
Yeah. And that's why our local group wants to revisit the town seal.
Yeah.
Because the town seal suggests this friendly exchange outside of the context of history, right?
Yeah. But it's part of it's funny. What I realize is in school, we didn't have history books. We had very long brochures, public relations brochures that were selling us a bill of goods. It was this wonderful, happy story. And, all of this becomes part of becomes part and parcel of the ridiculous narrative. Yeah. And then, unraveling the narrative. The exchange of the fish and the biscuit, that becomes a major thing. But part of it is also when we look at people trying, in terms of the comfort zone factor. Let's take a look at the atrocity that happened in Standing Rock, the water issue. And the fact that people are just starting to get things right now with the situation. And in terms of getting things locked down. Well, it was very interesting that we could get hundreds of people in Massachusetts motivated to shake their fist yelling, "Stand with Standing Rock, stand with Standing Rock, stand with Standing Rock." I would say we got less than a third of that crowd when the cry was "Stand with Mashpee." Because standing with Mashpee possibly meant changing things for themselves, changing the ways that they had to do things, changing the situation for a Native community that's in their area. It's much easier to do it if you're talking about a community that's 1,000 miles west, because you're removed from that. That has no impact on you. But the possibility even of economic prosperity for Native people in your own state is even subconsciously so threatening to you.
Absolutely.
That you can't stand, that you can stand with Standing Rock, but you can't stand with your neighbor. Yeah. Tells me volumes about who you are.
Yes, absolutely. I sense Jaime would like to add something to this. Would you like to, Jaime?
Oh, no, I was chuckling along at the subtle ironies that Mwalim was bringing up, because these inconsistencies are so apparent to us, because we've lived through them for so long. and yet they are often overlooked by the dominant culture.
Yes, absolutely. So there's a couple of comments in the chat. One that I'm struggling to wrap my mind around, but I will share it in case you would like to address it, either one of you. The question is, how long ago did Watertown investigate the Indigenous heritage? And where is this information gathered? And the reason I'm struggling with the question is I don't really know what it means. Did Watertown investigate, first of all? Because I don't know what it's like there are people here, we are people who live in Watertown. Some of us are concerned about that. There are teachers in the town, some of whom try to teach about some of this, others who don't. And where is the information gathered? Those of us who are researchers are constantly trying to learn more and unlearn the false narrative. So I wonder, would either one of you like to speak to that? And if not, we have a couple of other points. Someone says, ask the librarian. I don't know if Jill is still with us. And there's certainly a history room in the Watertown Public Library.
A little bit of an emergency. Excuse me one moment. I'm very sorry.
Okay.
I am still here, just so you know.
Thank you, Jill. Do you want to say anything about the history room in the library and what we have about the Indigenous history of our town there?
Well, as you know, because you've done a lot of research, there's not a ton. I mean, it's again, we do have a local history room, which has a lot of really wonderful things. It's a great collection. We have a lot of the early town records. But I think, as in most places, the vast majority of the history of the Indigenous peoples were written by the white settlers after the fact. So it's the view from the boat, even though those people have now stepped onto the shore. There's really not a lot from the perspective of the Indigenous peoples. So you spend a lot of time, I think historians grapple with this, trying to fill in the gaps. You read the different narratives and you figure out what happened, and then you try to fill in those holes and speculate what was the real story, or which part of the story are we not hearing. I know, Mishy, you did a lot of research in our collection, trying to find out some of the information you were looking for, and it's hard. And I think it's hard everywhere. So, we're happy to share what we've got with anyone who's looking for information, but I think there's a lot of holes, unfortunately.
And I'll just, give a shout out to my colleague and fellow researcher who's just a magnificent collaborator on a project that we're doing now, Christine Malpica, who's saying, check the Massachusetts Archives collection for primary sources. And, Christine and I are digging into both Mass archives and archives in Maine and in particular towns, as we try to make a case for the connection between evidence of genocide against Indigenous peoples in this region and land deeds and land purchases that in some cases were made with money that was gained from scalping Indigenous children, women, and men. And that is going to be the focus of the next Upstander Project film and a play we've commissioned. And I won't go down that rabbit hole, but someone is asking, what is the status of the movement to replace Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day in Watertown? And I guess, as a member of Pigsgusset Initiative, I would say we all need to make a lot of noise about that, or else it's not going to happen. So everybody who's on this call, if you are interested, please reach out to Pigsgusset Initiative, because it's, you know, it's something that that we know needs to be focused on, and at the state level as well. People are working this locally and also as statewide initiatives. And I'm wondering, there was a comment that I'm scrolling back to try to find about, Mwalim, I don't know if you want to respond to this, or Jaime, but I will read the question. About 15, 20 years ago, there was attention being paid to the fact that the first treaty entered between the newly declared independent nation, otherwise known as the United States, and the indigenous peoples of this region was signed in Watertown in July of 1776. And I'll just say that there have been annual commemorations of that on Marshall Street at the Watertown Historical Society building there. And the person who wrote this says, perhaps this was the beginning of broken treaties. How does this fit into the story? Mwalim, do you have anything you'd like to say about that?
That was actually one of several broken treaties. When you look at my ancestor Metacomet's uprising, that was the result of a broken treaty, of a broken promise. So treaties were being broken left and right. It started with the settlements. It started with the Mashpee colonies. These were all, you know, these were all the, you know, treaties being broken left and right. What would also happen is you would have a treaty possibly with one group and not even realize that that's not even their territory. Or you would assume that because you were good with this group, that this expanded to everybody. And we weren't necessarily the same groups. You know, that becomes part of the interesting issue with treaties. But by all means, yeah, that's just one of many that were, you know, that was just one in the continuum, left and right.
From the theater perspective and the storytelling perspective, I would say that that premise is perfect material for a new play, a new piece to be crafted around and then taken to school as part of history and local history, American history, and unlearning some outdated history.
And I guess you know, I think it's also important for us to acknowledge that those of us who live in this region, but especially those who live somewhat north of here, we're in a territory where English imperial powers, especially, European powers, especially England and France, recreated their wars in, you know, in the region north of here. And they were constantly trying to divide and conquer indigenous peoples by gaining their loyalty with promises of different kinds to split them off from one another. And so some treaties were entered in as agreements that were not designed for a lasting peace. They were designed to destroy confederations, and that, you know, even though treaties are sacrosanct in the United States Constitution, in the colonial era, treaties did not have a lasting effect. And if you look at, my colleague Christine put in the chat about the 1644 covenant, one of the earliest signed by multiple groups in the Mass Bay Colony. But before that, there was a treaty signed between Mwalim's ancestors and Plymouth Bay Colony. And it took only one generation for the betrayal to happen. So we need to look, we need to sort of back up and have a wide lens when we look to understand the meaning, the intent, and the impact over time of, what could have been agreements that allowed for settlers and the indigenous peoples of this region to coexist and cohabitate if there was respect for, okay, well, you can be on this side of the river, but these are our hunting grounds. This is where we live. This is where we plant. This is where we fish. And it was an unwillingness on the part of the English, especially, to honor hundreds, if not thousands, of agreements that were made that contributed to Palmetto Comet's resistance and centuries of warring. So we've now reached almost an hour and 15 minutes into our event, into our time together. I'm not seeing other questions in the chat, but if I've missed them, please re-enter your question now, and our colleague Sarah will signal that to me. Otherwise, I'm going to give Jaime and Mwalim, last words to close us out, if they'd like to say anything. And of course, all of this, it goes without saying, we're hoping to see everyone at the play when it opens. Tickets will be on sale before long. And this is going to be such an unusual experience, this play. And I guess Jill is wondering if you want to say anything more about the inspiration for the play and what to expect. And oh yes, of course, I want to reiterate something that my colleague Christine mentioned, which is something that a lot of those of us who are non-native don't know, which is that between 2.5 and 5 million indigenous peoples were enslaved in this country. And it is understudied, overlooked, often not mentioned when enslavement is introduced as a study topic, and it is essential that that be corrected in the way we teach and the way we present the narrative of this region. So with that, Jaime, Mwalim, is there anything else you'd like to say about the play?
Mwalim, you want to go first?
I guess I should first disclose this. I'm part of a movement that reintroduced our clown tradition of the Wampanoag, which ended up getting sort of suppressed, if you will, 150 years ago, roughly. The Hanainen, and which means laughter, man of laughter, keeper of laughter. And so that, I have to say, governs a lot of what I do, and especially in a topic like this. So what can you expect? That you won't require signing an insurance waiver. You can expect that you won't have to sign an insurance waiver. That the theater forced me to remove the pyrotechnics from the script. And the axe juggling scene was completely taken out. So sadly, the entertainment value has been cut dramatically. But with that, I'm teasing, I'm sorry. But with that, One thing that I thought about with the play actually goes back to when I think about fragility. And this was an actual note that I wrote, because I write side notes as I'm writing a script. A few months back, people might remember that the statue of Columbus in the North End got beheaded. Well, what happened was Native people from all over Massachusetts were making tourist pilgrimages to Boston to take a picture of the headless Columbus. And unfortunately, my son and I were a day late, because we got there like hours after the mayor of Boston removed the statue. And we were thinking, this could have been a wonderful healing opportunity. And the irony that I want to reflect on is that when the English beheaded Metacomet, his head hung on a post in the middle of Plymouth, what's now Post Office Square in Plymouth. It hung there for 35 years. So for 35 years, you had a man's head hanging up in the middle of the United States hometown, but you couldn't keep up a statue of a headless Columbus for 2 days. That's the epitome of white fragility as far as I'm concerned. So that's one of the little stories that I can say informed elements of the narrative.
Thank you, Mwalim. And that is not the only head that was put on a spike for decades by English colonial settlers in this region.
Quite true.
If I may, I would love to first acknowledge some friends from my high school that I just noticed are on and joining us here. Hi, Megan, and hi, Denise. It's so beautiful to see your names pop up here. That's very special. And I would just want everyone to understand that we're not just doing a two-person play in a park. Okay, this project is teeming with substance beyond what it seemingly appears to be. And what do I mean by that? This is an effort to engage local Indigenous artists here that hasn't been done typically by a traditional establishment theater. It's also an attempt to build a bit of a movement so that the project is not just a one-off and you pat yourself on the back and the organization gets to pat itself on the back, and then we don't think about these artists or these voices for another 5 years or so, when it's time to break out the old programming and what are we going to fill in here. All right, what I'm discovering through working on this piece is the urgent need to keep the ball in the air. And that means partnering with organizations, with artists, and with you, the audience. Theater is not possible without you, the audience. And we hope that you will want to share with us as much as we want to share with you.
Thank you, Jaime. Thank you, Mwalim. Thank you, Jill. Thank you, Sarah. This event was the coming together of 3 organizations: our magnificent Free Public Library, the new Repertory Theatre, and its extraordinary playwright and director, and a very small but mighty group with a big vision called the Pigsgusset Initiative. I look forward to seeing all of you by the river with the geese near the tree as the wind refreshes us and allows us to experience whatever our brilliant colleagues create for us and the actors who are going to join them. Please spread the word. We need there to be a massive turnout. Bring people from all the different institutions and groups in town, bring students, adults. This is going to be an amazingly important cultural and learning and unlearning experience for those of us who are fortunate to live in the place now called Watertown or Pigsgusset. So with that, I bid you all a good evening. Please stay healthy and safe, and thank you for being with us.